Tamia Johnson drove home from the community center, tired but satisfied after organizing another successful neighborhood cleanup event. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge Heights, the suburban neighborhood she and her husband Anthony had moved into just 6 months ago. They'd saved for years to afford a home in this area with its good schools and safe parks. As one of the few black families in the neighborhood, they'd faced some curious looks, but overall, the transition had been smoother than expected. Until Officer Mercer appeared in her rearview mirror. The police cruiser's lights flashed, and Tanya sighed as she pulled over, the third time this month. She reached for her purse, already knowing the drill. License and registration ready, hands visible on the steering wheel. Anthony had taught her that, small actions that could mean the difference between a routine stop and something worse. License and registration, Officer Mercer said, leaning down to peer through her window. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes moved suspiciously around her car's interior. Tanya had purchased this SUV 3 years ago when her real estate business started taking off. It was nice but not flashy. Still, in this neighborhood, a black woman driving it seemed to raise questions. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Tanya kept her voice calm and professional, the same tone she used with difficult clients. "Taillights out," Mercer replied, though Tanya had checked all her lights just yesterday after the last stop. "You live around here?" The question came with a hint of doubt, as if her presence in this zip code was automatically suspicious. "Yes, on Maple Street." She handed over her documents, the address clearly matching the neighborhood. Officer Mercer studied her license longer than necessary. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "May I ask why?" "I smell something suspicious. Need to check the vehicle." There was no smell. Tanya didn't even wear perfume today, but she knew better than to argue. As she stood on the roadside, neighbors driving past slowed to watch. Mrs. Wilson from 2 doors down didn't wave as she usually did when they met at the mailboxes. The shame burned worse than anger as Officer Mercer made a show of searching her car, emptying her gym bag onto the seat, flipping through her work documents. 20 minutes later, he found nothing because there was nothing to find. No ticket, no warning, just a curt nod before he left her to clean up the mess. That night, as Tanya recounted the story to Anthony over dinner, she tried to laugh it off. "Maybe I should start a punch card, 10 stops, and I get a free coffee." Anthony didn't smile. As an FBI agent who worked public corruption cases, he recognized patterns. "That's the 3rd stop this month, and always the same officer." "Always Mercer," Tanya nodded, pushing food around her plate. "But what can I do? It's his word against mine." "Not necessarily," Anthony said, his voice taking on the quiet intensity that appeared when he was working through a problem. "We document everything. Times, dates, reasons given. If there's a pattern. I just want to live our lives, Anthony. We worked hard for this house. I don't want trouble." Anthony reached across the table for her hand. "And that's exactly why we can't ignore this. This is our home now." Later that week, when Officer Mercer pulled her over claiming she'd rolled through a stop sign she knew she'd stopped at completely, Tanya was ready. The small dashboard camera Anthony had installed captured everything. Mercer's approach, his questions about what she was doing in this neighborhood, his hand resting on his gun when she reached for her registration. What had started as random harassment was beginning to look like something much more deliberate. Tanya wasn't just imagining things. And as she met Anthony's eyes that evening while they reviewed the footage together, she knew this was just the beginning. The small notebook in Tanya's purse grew heavier with each entry. Date, time, location, reason given for the stop. A growing record of Officer Mercer's harassment that she couldn't ignore anymore. 2 weeks had passed since she and Anthony had decided to document everything, and the stops had only increased. Tuesday, 5:15 p.m., corner of Elm and Main. Alleged failure to signal. Tanya read from her notes as Anthony prepared dinner. Their roles had reversed tonight. She was too tired after another confrontation with Mercer to do anything but sit at the kitchen counter, a glass of wine untouched beside her. Anthony listened quietly as he chopped vegetables, his jaw tightening with each detail. "And he asked to search your car again?" "Yes." "I refused this time, like you suggested. He didn't like that." Tanya took a deep breath. He made me stand there for almost an hour while he called for backup and wrote me up for everything he could think of. 3 tickets, Anthony. 3. Her voice cracked slightly. Mrs. Peterson from my book club drove by. She didn't even look at me. Anthony set down his knife and moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You did everything right. We'll fight the tickets. It's not about the tickets, Tanya said. Yesterday at the supermarket, people from the neighborhood were whispering when I walked by, like I'm some kind of criminal. I built my real estate business on my reputation, and now, she closed her eyes briefly. I had 2 clients cancel this week. Anthony's face hardened. He'd been careful to keep his FBI work separate from their personal life, but the lines were blurring now. That morning, he'd quietly pulled some records on Officer Mercer. What he found disturbed him deeply. I think it's time I showed you something, he said, reaching for his laptop. On the screen, he pulled up a map of their neighborhood with small red dots scattered across it. Each dot is a traffic stop Mercer made in the last 6 months. The dots formed a clear pattern, concentrated around the few homes owned by Black and Hispanic families in their predominantly white neighborhood. How did you get this? Tanya asked, leaning closer. Public records, nothing classified. Anthony clicked another tab. And this is interesting. Traffic stops in our neighborhood have increased 300% since this development company announced plans for new luxury homes. He pointed to a name on the screen, Westview Properties. Tanya's eyes widened. They're the ones who lost the bid on the Thompson land to that Black developer. What was his name? Lawrence something. Lawrence Washington, Anthony nodded. After he won that bid, these traffic stops started increasing. And look who sits on Westview's board. He scrolled down to reveal a familiar name, Phillips. As in Lieutenant Phillips, Mercer's boss. Tanya's real estate instincts kicked in. They're trying to control who moves into the neighborhood to protect property values. And using police harassment to do it. Anthony closed the laptop. This is bigger than just Mercer having issues with us. It's systematic. That night, as they lay in bed, Tanya stared at the ceiling. What do we do now, if his boss is involved? Anthony turned to face her. We need more evidence. Solid proof that connects these dots. His voice was gentle but determined. The dash cam footage helps, but we need more. Would you be willing to keep documenting everything? I know it's hard. Tanya thought about the clients she'd lost, the neighbors who no longer met her eyes, the constant knob of anxiety in her stomach whenever she saw a police car. Then she thought about other families who might move into the neighborhood only to face the same treatment. I'll do it, she said firmly. But I want to be smart about this. If we're going to expose them, we need to be thorough. The next morning, Tanya installed a second hidden camera in her car and downloaded an app that Anthony suggested, one that would automatically record and upload any interaction when she spoke a trigger phrase. As she drove to work, a police cruiser pulled out behind her. In the rearview mirror, she could see Officer Mercer's face. Her heart raced, but instead of the familiar fear, she felt something different. Determination. When the lights flashed behind her, Tanya pulled over calmly. As Mercer approached, she discreetly pressed the record button on her phone and spoke clearly. Good morning, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped today? The evidence collection had begun. Anthony sat in his office at the FBI field headquarters, door closed, blinds drawn. On his desk lay a small thumb drive containing weeks of evidence that Tanya had gathered. Next to it sat a stack of police reports he legally obtained through professional channels. What had started as a hunch was now taking shape as something far more troubling. He clicked through the dash cam footage again. Officer Mercer's face appeared on screen, his expression changing subtly when he recognized Tanya behind the wheel. The officer's hand automatically moving to rest on his gun, a detail that made Anthony's blood run cold every time he saw it. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His colleague, Det Rodriguez, poked his head in. You've been holed up in here during lunch 3 days in a row. Everything okay? Anthony hesitated. He trusted Rodriguez. They'd worked together for years, but he'd been careful to keep this investigation private. Close the door, Anthony finally said. As Rodriguez settled into the chair across from him, Anthony turned his monitor. What do you see here? Rodriguez studied the footage of Officer Mercer's latest stop of Tanya. Textbook intimidation tactics. Unnecessary call for backup. Hand-on weapon despite no threat. His eyes narrowed. Who is this officer? James Mercer. Works in my neighborhood. Anthony paused. He's been targeting my wife. Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional curiosity to personal concern. Your wife? How long has this been happening? Almost 2 months now, but it's not just her. Anthony pulled up the map he'd created. Every dot is a traffic stop in our neighborhood in the past 6 months. Notice anything? Rodriguez leaned closer. They're concentrated around specific houses. He looked up. Minority homeowners. Anthony nodded. And look at this. He pulled up property records showing recent sales. Every time a minority family moves in, traffic stops in that area spike. 2 families have already moved out after constant harassment. Rodriguez whistle blow. You thinking hate crime? Civil rights violations. It goes deeper. Anthony showed him Lieutenant Phillips' connection to Westview Properties. They're using police power to control who lives in the neighborhood, protecting their investment interests. This is serious, Rodriguez said, his voice dropping. How are you handling the conflict of interest issue? This involves your wife. That's why I needed to talk to you, Anthony admitted. I can't be officially involved in any investigation, but this needs to be looked at by someone who won't sweep it under the rug. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Let me make some calls. Public Corruption Division would want to see this. He studied Anthony's face. How's your wife holding up? Anthony's professional demeanor cracked slightly. She's scared. Angry. But mostly determined. Yesterday, she told me she refused to be driven out of our home. Pride mixed with worry in his voice. She's gathering evidence every day, despite what it's costing her. What do you mean? Her real estate clients are canceling. Neighbors avoid her. She's being treated like a criminal in her own community. Anthony's jaw tightened. Last week, someone keyed her car. Wrote go back where you came from. Rodriguez shook his head. Does she want to come in? Make a formal complaint? Not yet, Anthony said. She's worried about retaliation if they find out I'm FBI. We need to build a solid case first. He hesitated. There's something else. I think they're communicating about their targets. He pulled up text messages recovered from the department's server, messages between Mercer and 3 other officers, including Lieutenant Phillips. The texts contained coded language about new neighbors and property values, with specific addresses mentioned, all belonging to minority homeowners. They're coordinating, Rodriguez said, his expression grim. You've got enough here to justify surveillance. That evening, Anthony returned home later than usual. He found Tanya in their home office, updating her documentation log. Her face looked tired but resolved. How was your day? He asked, setting his briefcase down. 2 more stops, she replied without looking up. Mercer and a new officer I hadn't seen before. Officer Wilson. She finally met his eyes. They're watching our house, Anthony. Wilson admitted it. Said they were keeping an eye on suspicious new residents. Anthony sat beside her, taking her hand. I talked to Rodriguez today. When Tanya's eyebrows raised in surprise, he continued, we needed help from someone we can trust. He thinks we have enough to start an official investigation. Tanya was quiet for a moment. Will it make things worse before they get better? Possibly, Anthony answered honestly. But we're not alone in this anymore. Tanya squeezed his hand. Good, because I have something new. She turned her laptop to show him footage from their doorbell camera. On screen, Officer Mercer slowly drove by their house, stopping briefly before moving on. The timestamp showed 2 a.m. 5th night in a row, she said quietly. They're not just targeting me on the road anymore. They're watching our home. Anthony felt a chill run through him. The harassment was escalating. As FBI, he knew what that could mean and what they needed to do next. Tomorrow, he said firmly, we take this to the next level. The conference room at the FBI field office felt too small for the weight of the conversation taking place inside it. Anthony sat beside Rodriguez as they presented their evidence to Special Agent Diane Carter, head of the Public Corruption Division. Tanya's careful documentation spread across the table, photographs, recordings, timestamps of every interaction with Officer Mercer and his colleagues. This is thorough work, Carter said, reviewing the text messages between the officers. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes revealed her disgust. "And you believe Lieutenant Phillips is coordinating this harassment?" Anthony nodded. "The messages show it clearly. They target specific homeowners, all minorities. Hove moved into neighborhoods where Westview Properties has development interests." Rodriguez added, "We've identified at least 7 families who've been subjected to this treatment. 3 have already moved away." He pushed forward a folder. "Here are the property records. Westview bought 2 of those homes below market value after the families left." Carter turned to Anthony. "And your wife is still experiencing this harassment?" "Daily," Anthony replied, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "Last night, patrol cars circled our block 6 times. Our neighbors are watching, wondering what we've done wrong." He paused. "She had to close her real estate office temporarily. Clients don't want to be associated with someone who's constantly being pulled over by police." Carter was quiet for a moment. "You understand I have to ask this. Are you prepared for what comes next? An official investigation means your wife may need to continue experiencing this harassment while we build the case. We can't tip them off." Anthony had expected this question. He and Tanya had spent hours discussing it the night before. "We understand." Tanya says, his voice softened slightly. She says if they drive her out, another family will face the same treatment. She's willing to see this through. Carter nodded with respect. "We'll need to place surveillance on these officers, get warrants for their private communications." She looked directly at Anthony. "And you know you'll need to recuse yourself officially from the investigation." "Already prepared the paperwork," Anthony said, sliding a folder toward her. "Rodriguez will be my family's point of contact." As they left the meeting, Rodriguez placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "We'll get these guys. Carter's the best at public corruption cases." Anthony checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Tanya. His stomach tightened as he called back. "They've been to the house," Tanya said immediately, her voice tight with restraint. "Mercer and 2 other officers. They said there was a complaint about a disturbance." "Were you alone?" Anthony asked, already heading for his car. "Mrs. Lee from next door was here. We were planning the neighborhood garden project when they showed up." Tanya took a breath. "Anthony, they wanted to search the house. I refused without a warrant." Anthony felt cold dread and fierce pride simultaneously. "Good. What happened?" "They threatened to come back with one. Said they'd received reliable information about suspicious activity." Her laugh was bitter. Mrs. Lee was horrified. She started recording everything on her phone and told them she'd be calling her son, you know, the one who's a state attorney. Despite everything, Anthony smiled. Eleanor Lee, a 70-year-old retired teacher, had just become their unexpected ally. The officers backed off then, Tanya continued. "But Mercer said something as he was leaving. He told me to consider if this neighborhood is really right for you. It wasn't just a suggestion, Anthony." When Anthony arrived home, he found Tanya and Mrs. Lee still at the kitchen table, drinking tea. Mrs. Lee stood immediately, her small frame somehow imposing in her indignation. "Anthony, what those officers did was disgraceful," she said firmly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen such behavior from police." After Mrs. Lee left, promising to share what she'd witnessed with other neighbors, Anthony and Tanya sat in their living room, windows open to the cooling evening air. "Carter's opening an official investigation," Anthony said. "They'll need to gather more evidence, which means I need to keep acting normal," Tanya finished. "Keep documenting everything." She looked out the window at their front yard, where they'd planted flower beds just weeks ago. "I could leave, stay with my sister until this is over." Anthony took her hand. "What do you want to do?" Tanya was quiet for a long moment. "If I leave, they win. If I stay, it gets worse before it gets better." She turned to him, determination replacing fear in her eyes. "I'm staying, but we need to be smarter than them." That night, they developed their strategy. Rodriguez had provided small, specialized recording devices that Tanya could wear. The FBI would have surveillance teams watching Mercer and the other officers, but they needed to maintain their normal routines. "Mrs. Lee is already talking to neighbors," Tanya said. "People trust her. If she vouches for us, it could divide the neighborhood," Anthony warned. Some people won't want to get involved. And some will, Tanya replied. We don't need everyone, just enough good people to pay attention. As they prepared for bed, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez, surveillance approved. Teams in place by morning. Keep your wife safe. Anthony looked at Tanya, who was checking the new recording devices. The woman he'd married had always been strong, but watching her now, fighting not just for herself, but for others who might face the same injustice, he felt a new depth of admiration. What? She asked, catching his gaze. Just thinking that Officer Mercer has no idea who he's messing with. For the first time in weeks, Tanya smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. No, she agreed. He really does, which means I need to keep acting normal, Tanya finished. Keep documenting everything. She looked out the window at their front yard, where they'd planted flower beds just weeks ago. I could leave, stay with my sister until this is over. Anthony took her hand. What do you want to do? Tanya was quiet for a long moment. If I leave, they win. If I stay, it gets worse before it gets better. She turned to him, determination replacing fear in her eyes. I'm staying, but we need to be smarter than them. That night, they developed their strategy. Rodriguez had provided small, specialized recording devices that Tanya could wear. The FBI would have surveillance teams watching Mercer and the other officers, but they needed to maintain their normal routines. Mrs. Lee is already talking to neighbors, Tanya said. People trust her. If she vouches for us. It could divide the neighborhood, Anthony warned. Some people won't want to get involved. And some will, Tanya replied. We don't need everyone. Just enough good people to pay attention. As they prepared for bed, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez, surveillance approved. Teams in place by morning. Keep your wife safe. Anthony looked at Tanya, who was checking the new recording devices. The woman he'd married had always been strong, but watching her now, fighting not just for herself, but for others who might face the same injustice, he felt a new depth of admiration. What? She asked, catching his gaze. Just thinking that Officer Mercer has no idea who he's messing with. For the first time in weeks, Tanya smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. No, she agreed. He really doesn't. Rain fell in sheets as Tanya drove home from the grocery store, wipers fighting to clear her windshield. The past week had been surprisingly quiet, too quiet. No traffic stops, no police cars cruising slowly past their home. The sudden absence of harassment made her more nervous than its presence. They're planning something, she had told Anthony that morning. He agreed but encouraged her to stick to their normal routine while the FBI surveillance continued. The flash of police lights in her rearview mirror didn't surprise her. Almost expected, really. She pulled over, automatically reaching to ensure her recording device was active beneath her blouse. Officer Mercer approached, rain dripping from his hat. Unlike previous stops, he seemed almost relaxed, confident. That worried her more than his usual aggression. License and registration, he said, the routine request now familiar between them. Tanya handed them over, saying nothing, watching him closely. Step out of the vehicle, please. May I ask why? Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. I believe I smell marijuana coming from your vehicle. I need to search the car. Tanya's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. I don't consent to a search. Ma'am, I have probable cause. Please step out now. His hand moved to rest on his weapon, a gesture he knew intimidated her. Tanya stepped out into the rain, phone recording in her pocket. As the cold water soaked through her clothes, she watched Mercer circle her car, peering through windows. Then, unexpectedly, he opened the driver's door and leaned in. From where she stood, partly blocked by the open door, she couldn't see what he was doing. But the small camera hidden in her car could. 30 seconds passed before he straightened up, holding a small plastic bag. Well, he said, feigning surprise. Look what we have here. Tanya stared at the bag in disbelief. That's not mine. You just put that there. I'm going to have to place you under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, Mercer said, ignoring her protest. His voice carried satisfaction as he recited her rights. The handcuffs felt cold against her wrists. Rainwater dripped down her face as Mercer guided her to the back of his patrol car. Through the window, she watched another officer arrive and begin searching her car more thoroughly. At the police station, Tanya sat alone in an interview room, still damp from the rain. The door opened and Lieutenant Phillips entered, her first time meeting Mercer's supervisor in person. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, sitting across from her, "you've caused quite a stir in our quiet neighborhood." "By existing?" Tanya asked, her patience worn thin. Phillips ignored her comment. "The officer found marijuana in your vehicle. That's a misdemeanor charge, but given your history of traffic violations, the judge might not be lenient." Tanya met his gaze directly. "That bag isn't mine. Your officer planted it." Phillips shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "Everyone says that, but we have dash cam footage of the search." He leaned forward. "Here's what I'm willing to do. We can process this quietly. No need for your husband to get involved. His career might be affected if his wife has a drug charge." The threat was thinly veiled. Tanya almost laughed. They had no idea Anthony was already involved, or that she was wearing a recording device capturing every word. "And what would I need to do for this courtesy?" she asked, playing along. "Simple. Put your house on the market. This neighborhood, it's just not working out for you." Phillips shrugged. Some communities just fit better than others. There it was, the real agenda, spelled out clearly. "I need to call my lawyer," Tanya said, hiding her satisfaction at his mistake. Phillips stood. "Think about my offer. Once we process you, things get more complicated." Alone again, Tanya took slow, deep breaths. The recording device had captured everything. Now she just needed to get word to Anthony. Her opportunity came when Officer Wilson, a younger cop who seemed uncomfortable with the situation, brought her a cup of water. "I need to make my phone call," she said. Phillips said to wait. Wilson replied, glancing toward the door. "That's my right," Tanya insisted. "One phone call." Wilson hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Instead of calling Anthony directly, Tanya called their neighbor, Mrs. Lay. "Eleanor, I've been arrested," she said when the older woman answered. "Can you let my husband know? I'm at the central station." Using their pre-arranged code, she added, "Tell him I left the dash cam on." Within an hour, the station's atmosphere changed noticeably. Officers whispered to each other, glancing her way. Phillips disappeared into his office. Something was happening. By evening, Tanya sat in an interview room with a different door, this one at the FBI field office. Rodriguez sat across from her, reviewing her statement as a technician carefully preserved the recording device she'd worn. "You did everything right," Rodriguez assured her. "The plant is clear on your dash cam footage. Phillips offered to drop charges in exchange for you moving. That's textbook civil rights violation and corruption." The door opened and Anthony entered, his face a mix of fury and relief. Protocol forgotten, he embraced her tightly. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Did you get what you needed?" Rodriguez answered for him. "More than enough. The surveillance team recorded Mercer removing the bag from his pocket before finding it in your car. We have Phillips on tape discussing the scheme with Westview Properties representatives yesterday." He smiled grimly. "The search warrant for their phones and computers just came through. Teams are executing it now." Tanya leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "What happens next?" "You go home," Anthony said firmly. "The charges are being dropped. Carter's team is handling everything from here." As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez added, "Mrs. Johnson, what you did today, continuing to gather evidence even during your arrest, that was incredibly brave. This case would be much harder to prove without it." Tanya looked at the recording device now sealed in an evidence bag. Such a small thing to bring down what they were discovering was a years-long conspiracy of corruption. "I just want to go home," she said quietly. "Our real home. The one we chose. The one they tried to take from us." Anthony took her hand. "Let's go home then." As they drove through their neighborhood that night, Tanya noticed police cars at Lieutenant Phillips' house, FBI agents executing search warrants. Neighbors stood on porches, watching in confusion. The rain had stopped. In its place, a strange calm settled over everything. The storm had broken at last. The morning after Tanya's arrest, their phone wouldn't stop ringing. News traveled fast in small communities, even faster when FBI agents were seen leading police officers away in handcuffs. Anthony let the calls go to voicemail while Tanya slept, exhausted from her ordeal. When she finally woke near noon, he brought her coffee in bed. "How are you feeling?" Tanya sat up slowly. The previous day felt like a bad dream. "Better than I expected." She took the mug gratefully. "What's happening out there?" Rodriguez called earlier. They seized computers and phones from Phillips, Mercer, and 3 other officers last night. They're going through everything now. Anthony sat beside her. "The mayor has called an emergency press conference for this afternoon." Tanya nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "And the neighbors?" "Mrs. Lee has been fielding calls all morning. Apparently, she's appointed herself our spokesperson." Anthony smiled slightly. "She's been telling everyone who'll listen that we were set up." A knock at the front door interrupted them. Anthony went to answer it, returning with Mrs. Lee herself, carrying a casserole dish. "I hope I'm not intruding," the older woman said, setting the dish on their nightstand. "But I thought you might need something to eat, dear." And she hesitated. "There are about 20 neighbors gathered outside. They want to talk to you both." "What?" Tanya pushed back the covers. "Why?" "They feel terrible," Mrs. Lee explained. "Especially the ones who believe there must be something suspicious about you because of all those police stops. They want to apologize." Tanya exchanged a look with Anthony. "I need a shower first," she said. 30 minutes later, freshly dressed but still tired, Tanya and Anthony stepped onto their front porch. True to Mrs. Lee's word, a small crowd had gathered in their yard, neighbors they'd barely spoken to since moving in months ago. Mr. Chen from down the street stepped forward. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, we owe you an apology. Many of us saw what was happening but didn't speak up. We thought the police must have had reasons," added Mrs. Rivera, clutching her purse tightly. "My husband said we shouldn't get involved." One by one, neighbors expressed similar sentiments. Some had witnessed Tanya being pulled over. Others had seen patrol cars circling the house at odd hours. Most had simply heard rumors and stayed away from the trouble house on the block. "What happens now?" asked a young father holding his daughter's hand. "Are those officers going to jail?" Anthony stepped forward. "I can't discuss details of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you this isn't over. There's strong evidence of a coordinated effort to drive certain families out of this neighborhood." "Because they're black?" Mrs. Rivera asked bluntly. Tanya nodded. "Yes, and not just us. At least 7 other families in nearby neighborhoods experienced similar harassment." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mr. Chen spoke again. "My son and his wife were looking at a house on Maple Street last year. The real estate agent told them it wasn't available anymore, but it stayed listed for months." Others shared similar stories, subtle discouragements, police stops that seemed coincidental, strange encounters with local officials. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, several neighbors lingered to help clean up Tanya's garden, which had been trampled during the police search of their property. Working alongside people who had avoided her for months, Tanya felt a cautious sense of hope. That evening, she and Anthony watched the local news. The mayor, looking shaken, announced that 5 police officers had been suspended pending an FBI investigation into civil rights violations and corruption. Sources close to the investigation report that officers targeted minority homeowners in upscale neighborhoods, the reporter said. Evidence suggests connections to local real estate interests hoping to control property values through intimidation. Anthony muted the TV. "Rodriguez called while you were talking with the neighbors. They'd found text messages between Phillips and the CEO of Westview Properties discussing how to handle the diversity problem in certain neighborhoods." "How deep does this go?" Tanya asked quietly. "They've issued subpoenas for Westview's financial records. Early signs point to kickbacks to Phillips and possibly others in city government." Anthony took her hand. "This is bigger than we thought, Tanya. The U.S. attorney is personally reviewing the case." 2 days later, Tanya returned to her real estate office for the first time since her arrest. She'd barely unlocked the door when the phone rang. "Johnson Realty," she answered, her professional voice back in place. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Thomas Washington." The name was familiar, Lawrence Washington's brother. The family had been developing properties in the area for years. "I heard what happened to you. My brother experienced something similar last year." Yes, I believe he's one of the people they targeted, Tanya confirmed. Lawrence moved his business to Atlanta after the harassment, Thomas explained. But I stayed. Been keeping records of every suspicious interaction since then. He paused. The FBI contacted me yesterday. I'm going to testify about what happened to our family. By the end of the week, 6 more families had come forward with similar stories. The FBI investigation expanded to include a city council member who had received campaign contributions from Westview Properties. Tanya spent hours with FBI agents reviewing years of real estate transactions in neighborhoods where harassment had occurred. Her professional knowledge proved invaluable as they traced patterns of property sales following police intimidation. You could have a future in financial crime investigation, Rodriguez joked as they compiled evidence of property value manipulation. I prefer selling homes to people who deserve them, Tanya replied, thinking of the families who had been driven away. At home that evening, Tanya found Anthony in the backyard, planting new flowers to replace those damaged during her arrest. You know what I realized today? She said, kneeling beside him in the dirt. All those people coming forward now, they each thought they were alone. They each thought maybe they were imagining things, or maybe they deserved what was happening. Anthony nodded, understanding where she was going. Isolation is a powerful weapon. Exactly. Tanya pressed soil around a small plant. The whole system counted on people not talking to each other, not connecting the dots. She looked up at their home, windows glowing warmly in the evening light. They never expected us to fight back together. The evidence continued to mount. Each day brought new revelations, new connections between corrupt officers and real estate interests. What had started with Tanya's traffic stops was growing into one of the largest corruption cases the district had seen in decades. For the first time in months, when Tanya drove through her neighborhood, no police lights appeared in her rearview mirror. The battle wasn't over, but finally she could drive home in peace.